All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome so much, or welcome. Thank you so much for coming to this library event. My name is Catherine, and I'm one of the librarians here at Portage District Library. We're so glad you could tune in for this Michigan author talk with George D. Jepson. He will be talking about his book, Crash Boat: Rescue and Peril in the Pacific During World War II. Let me tell you a little bit about George before we get started. George D. Jepson is the editorial director for McBooks Press, previously worked as a journalist and corporate communicator. As a freelance writer and editor, he was a regular contributor to Wooden Boat magazine and various other publications. Jepson worked in the maritime book trade for more than 2 decades and founded Quarter Deck, a journal dedicated to celebrating maritime literature and art. In addition, he holds degrees in English and history, as well as an MBA. Jepson and his wife Amy live in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and we are so glad to have him here tonight to talk about Crash Boat. Please help me give him a warm welcome.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, thank you all for coming out this evening. It's a pleasure for me to do this in this area. The real spark for this book probably started in 1961 and 1962, just down the road on Westnedge at Portage High School. I had a teacher by the name of Tony Giannunzio. I don't know if anybody knows that name, but he was a longtime teacher in the system. And somehow he thought I had some kind of a spark for writing. At that time, I thought I was going to be an engineer. And so as a senior, I had to take his class. I had to take his class. And I'm glad that I did. I went to Western in engineering, and 2 years in, I had been working for the Western Herald, the college newspaper. Didn't like anything I was doing in engineering. In the summers, I worked for a local company and crunching numbers, and after 2 years, I decided that wasn't going to be for me. And my career then moved forward with the Kalamazoo Gazette, and then later on I moved to the Upjohn Company in corporate communications. And basically throughout my whole life, work life, writing has been a common thread. The real story behind Crash Boat, actually the seed for this book probably started in 1946 or 47, right after my dad returned home from the Pacific. We had a trunk. I don't know if you in your families might have had these trunks as well. They kind of had a humpback, and it was wood and metal strips. And as a little shaver, I used to like to sneak down to the basement and look in this trunk, and it had all kinds of interesting things in there, including a grass skirt that smelled like the South Pacific, and scrapbooks and photograph books. And in that book was a series of pictures from the Pacific, and kind of got me my interest. That was the first picture that really got me going right there. That picture was taken by my dad from the deck of another boat running next to it. The island behind there is called Halmahera. It was a Japanese-held island and had about 90,000 Japanese on it at the time. The picture in the book was 2 inches square. Just a little bitty picture, but I was really taken by that picture. And over time, I started to thumb through it, and these were 2 of my heroes at that time. The fellow on the left is Earl McCandlish, who is the co-author of this book, and on the right is my dad. And I was always taken by Earl McCandlish, who we always knew as the skipper, because he looked a lot like Clark Gable. And he really, you know, in all the pictures of him, he was just a handsome guy. One day, when we started to work on the book, I asked him why the mustache, and he said he grew the mustache when they were in the Pacific because of all of the salt from the water, and it kept getting into his mouth. So with the mustache, the salt would catch on the mustache. Just an interesting sidelight. This is the crew that went overseas, and these were the ordinary guys like all of us when we were growing up. Not one of them was a professional military person. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they all enlisted. And they were pretty young. It was the best years of their lives that they gave up. And their story is what really kind of drove me as I wrote this with the skipper. The boat itself went from Guadalcanal. You've probably heard of Guadalcanal if you know anything about World War II in the Pacific. And they took that boat all the way through the slot in the Solomon Islands, across over to the Trobriand Islands, up to New Guinea, and ultimately ended up where a lot of the action took place around Morotai Island and Halmahera, where that picture of the boat took place. And ultimately they ended up in the Philippines, and the boat itself was beached and turned over to the Filipinos at the end of the war in 1945. They also had a combat artist that showed up, and this is a sketch that he did. We think that's the P-399. We're not positive because there were some other crash boats out there as well, but that was published in a book at the end of the war. And this is kind of an interior picture of the boat with the skipper and my dad. And then over on the right is the skipper next to the bridge. And it's a parachute with a seahorse, and then the marks at that time of the people that they had saved, the pilots that they had picked up. And this is at one of the islands. It could have been in the Trobriand Islands. I'm not really sure where it was taken, but they had a swim call, and they swam back from the native village, and were climbing back aboard the boat. And they did have some fun over there. The guy on the left is a fellow by the name of Whitey Cheney. That's my dad. Then the skipper, and then George Savard, who was the warrant officer in charge of the engine on the boat. And this is also some kind of fun. They used to like to have practice with those 50 caliber machine guns. And taking place. The fellow on the right responded. I don't have his name, but that's who he was. And there's another shot of the boat. There's the grand old girl. That's how the skipper remembered her. Now the way this whole thing started, as I said, as a kid I was really interested in the boat. And growing up in Millwood, I used to go to the bookmobile. I don't know if you guys remember bookmobiles or not, but they would show up in the parking lot of schools and shopping centers. And the librarians would allow me to take out histories of World War II that were being written in the 1950s. They were adult books, but they allowed me to take them out because they knew I had that interest. And then things happen in life. You move on, you're a teenager, and you go off to college, and you meet girls, and you do all of the things that you do at that stage of your life, and I kind of forgot about it. And then about 1990, my dad was about 70 years old at the time, and I finally convinced him to sit down for an interview so I could talk to him about the war and the boat itself. And any of you that have either been in the military or been in a combat situation understand that a lot of these people just don't want to talk about what they experienced. And my dad was one of those. But I finally got him to talk about it, and so I recorded it and put it away. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. And then about 5 years later, I lost my dad. And we were living in Iowa at the time, my wife Amy and I, and I always knew the skipper by the name Skipper. And one day I said to Amy, I'm going to call him. So I did. I picked up the phone and called him in Poughkeepsie, New York. And I said, I presume you know the name George Jepson? And he said, yes. You know, he did because of my dad, who carried the same name. And so for about, I don't know, a month and a half, 2 months, we talked on the phone every week or 2 weeks. And every time I talked to him, he started to tell these stories. And finally, after about 2.5 weeks or 2.5 months, I said, have you ever thought about writing a book? And he said he'd been waiting 50 years for somebody to ask. So I said, well, what do you think? And so he said, we will. So he started to write down his memories from the very beginning until the end of the war. And as he did that, I transcribed those things and did a lot of vetting just to make sure that the history was right, you know, as far as timing goes, because over the 50 to 60 years since the war, his memory was a little foggy at the time. And we had a manuscript done, and he passed away. He was 89 years old. And so I thought, well, that's the end of that. We had a private publishing company do a book for him so that he had it, and so he saw it in print. But there were a lot of questions that still needed to be answered. Well, 20 years later, I talked to an acquisitions editor at Lyons Press in Essex, Connecticut. And he looked at the original manuscript and said, we want to publish it. So we went back through the process, and I went back and I was able to dig into not only the skipper's memoirs, but my dad's letters and my interview with my dad, and then a lot of history. And that's how the book finally came about. Are there any questions as I'm going along here? Feel free to ask. Tom?
He said, we want to publish it. And then
Yeah.
you talked about more in-depth
Right.
research that you did.
Yeah.
How much did it change from when he said we want to publish it to what it turned out to be?
Well, the basic story that the skipper told pretty much stayed the same, but I was able to go back and add things from my dad's letters that added color, added more detail of certain things, because it was from a different perspective. And
You fleshed it out.
I did. And I also had to go back and vet it from historical fact. There were some facts that weren't exactly the way we had originally thought they were. And but with the way the internet is today and everything else, you can get into a lot of archives to find out. And but by and large, everything he told me was pretty much accurate. It was just that I needed to straighten some things out.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. So, was this Army because it also it looked like he was in Army uniform, but then you showed the crew with like sailor caps.
Okay, they were all in.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh yes. He wants me to repeat the question for those that are viewing outside. Was this Army? Yes, it was Army. Actually, it was the United States Army Air Force, and just before the war, it was called the Army Air Corps. But without trying to go into too much detail, back in about 1942 and 43, after the war started, there was a lot of action going on in the Pacific, and aircraft out there were going down, and it was pretty difficult to find ways to save the pilots. Submarines did it. PT boats did it. But back in the United States, the services got together and decided that they needed to have a dedicated operation that wasn't just going to be for the Pacific, also for the European theater in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. And they set up a series of emergency rescue boat units. This was the 15th emergency rescue boat unit that was initially sent to Guadalcanal. And basically what they did was on the day of a bombing attack, when we would send out, like this group was for the 13th Air Force, they would go out ahead of the strike and position themselves so that when the planes would be coming back, if they were either damaged or just ran out of fuel, the boat would be close enough that they could go pick up survivors. And so that's how it went. They also had a fellow by the name of Dare Long, who was a naval architect that the United States hired, and he designed this boat. It was based on a whole lot of years of experience that he had leading up to the war. The U.S. Navy also used these boats, the same design, the 63-foot version of the crash boat.
So it was designed as a rescue boat?
It was. The interior of the boat had a sick bay, believe it or not, in that they had a medic aboard the boat, and they had a place for a couple of really injured people to be taken care of. They all had bunks. They had a galley. They lived on this boat for 18 months in the Pacific. They didn't have to live on land, and they were really glad of that. Plus, they could cook aboard the boat and that sort of thing. Any other questions related to that?
Coach, one more question on the boat itself. Was there one of the known builders of these types of boats at the time that actually built them, like Hutchins or Garwood? Or
They were built all over. In fact, some of these boats were built in Benton Harbor. They were built in Miami. This particular boat was built in Wilmington, California.
Wooden?
Wooden, all wood, not plywood. It had 2 layers of really good cedar and the sort of stuff that you would put into a boat. It could have been a yacht, except it was painted a little bit differently. Okay. Why don't I read a little bit from the book here, just to kind of introduce you to some of it. There were about 3 different steps in the careers of the members of the crew. In my dad's case, because he had grown up on Lake Superior and had operated sizable boats, he was already assigned to a rescue boat squadron down in Texas, operating out of right near Corpus Christi. And the skipper, who did have some experience with a yacht going back to the mid-1930s, he worked for the owner of the New York Yankees and a brewing company out there. And this guy had a yacht called the Garwood, I think was the name of it. And at any rate, over one summer, they dragged Lake Champlain and found one of Benedict Arnold's gunboats that is now in the Smithsonian. But they dragged that. But that was his experience. And I've got a little section here I'll read you about what his thoughts were. But as I started the book, it started off with this little vignette. On a May morning in 1944, light rain fell under low scudding clouds as the Liberty ship James J. Corbett steamed slowly into the Sealark Channel, part of a small convoy bound for Guadalcanal. Corbett, named for the American boxer best known for defeating John L. Sullivan, was positioned in the convoy's coffin corner, the last ship in the last lane. And remember, this is in the words of the skipper. Our 63-foot United States Air Force Air Sea Rescue boat, the P-399, was secured across a cargo hatch. During our 4,500-mile voyage across the Pacific from San Francisco, our 8-man crew lived aboard the crash boat, which we later named Seahorse. Our sister boat, P-400, was made fast across another hatch. As we finished breakfast in the ship's mess, Navy gun crews on the bow and stern opened fire. The call of General Quarters, all hands man your battle stations, sent us scurrying on deck. The sound of watertight doors slamming shut echoed throughout the ship. A Navy destroyer screening the convoy charged by us, belching smoke in its loud, high-pitched whoop, whoop, whoop alarm piercing the air. A lookout on the bridge wing had spotted the telltale wake of a periscope in the water. Corbett lurched into a zigzag pattern along with the other ships in convoy, while the escorting destroyers stalked the suspected Japanese submarine. Some of our crew had volunteered to man guns. Others stood by the rail watching the destroyers while our hearts beat a little faster. After a relaxing, uneventful cruise across the Pacific, reality struck. This was a war zone. And that was their introduction over there. But as I said, it all started back for the skipper in New Orleans, where he was sent down there to train skippers for crash boats. Now, he wasn't sure that what he was going to do when he got there, but when he got there, he was a little surprised. I just wanted to... Sorry. He wrote that the school charged us with training new skippers to run, navigate, and command air-sea rescue boats. Instruction was to focus on dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and boat handling. I couldn't believe the school had given me this responsibility. Arriving at the yacht club, this on the Lake Pontchartrain down there where they were stationed, I was bowled over when I saw that my boat was 110 feet long. The P-100 was initially designed by the Navy as a subchaser or salvage vessel during World War I. Aghast, I resolved to make it clear to the commanding officer that I was only qualified to instruct trainees in navigation, not how to command this relic from the Great War. Well, turned out that they thought that he did, and so he continued to do that. After their training, they moved on to Wilmington, where the boat was launched. And they ran through certain exercises out there. Each morning at 0730 hours, we cleared Wilmington Harbor's south or east sea gates on test runs, conducting gunnery practice, compensating our compasses, and carrying out speed trials, including over the bottom at various engine RPMs. We also dropped depth charges after Navy clearance to ensure one of our subs was not down there, and communicated with signal flags in our radio. The boat passed each test with flying colors. Now they did have, as I said, they did have a little fun before they got over in the Pacific. One evening when we tied up, there was a message waiting for me from Harbor Operations requesting a favor. Would the P-399 provide a ride to Catalina Island for a USO troop performing at the Navy Hospital, drop them off and pick them up at Avalon later in the day? We were pleased, of course, to assist. The next morning we were standing by our dock when two cars arrived at about 1000 hours. One carried George Murphy, the movie star and later U.S. Senator from California, who was the group's leader. With him were film actor Phil Silvers carrying a clarinet, singer and film actress Deanna Durbin, dancer Patty Thomas, guitarist Tony Romano, and comedian Jerry Colonna. Little things like that, you know, that I guess compensated for not being where they wanted to be with their families back home. There's another section here that I wanted to be sure to get. Okay. One day the skipper, when they were in Wilmington, called the crew together and told them we were sailing about 20 miles due south to Balboa near Newport Beach to gas up. The southerly course would have had the boat broadside to massive waves. Turned out that weather reports warned of a near hurricane force line storm with 60-mile-per-hour winds that was predicted to hit the Wilmington area during the night. Hollis, the radio operator, picked up an announcement on our base radio that small craft would not be permitted to leave the harbor. Even though the crew understood the risk involved, there wasn't a glance or a murmur from anyone when I ordered all hands on deck. George Savard was strapped to the engine room below, and Whitey was going to relieve him every 30 minutes. Jep didn't question whether we could run the South Sea Gate with small craft warning flags snapping in the wind and guards stationed over the egress. We both knew they would report the P-399 to Navy operations and the Los Angeles Port of Debarkation commander. The submarine nets at each end of the harbor entrances were 3 fathoms below mean tide levels, so that wouldn't be a problem. We drew only 5.5 feet, so off we charged. As we approached the South Sea Gate, lookouts waved us off. We acted as though we didn't see them or the flag warnings. Inside the Wilmington breakwater, the waves were high, but nothing like the seas that hit us as we cleared the gate. The guards screamed unheeded into the wind. We plunged into the teeth of a full gale. Sailing the P-399, setting the proper speed and quartering the huge waves, left little time to consider the prudence of running in the storm, but it was essential to prepare us for what might lie ahead. It's kind of like to ask for forgiveness instead of permission from the authorities. What were they going to do, right? When they got to Guadalcanal, after the part that I read in the beginning here, returning from a routine patrol one afternoon, we found an Army Air Force captain and a master sergeant, both wearing MP bands, waiting for us in a Jeep on the pier at Lunga Point when the Seahorse docked. The captain ordered me to turn command over to the next ranking officer, in this case George, a warrant officer, and accompany them to headquarters. Astonished, I directed George and Jep, responsible for the deck when I wasn't aboard, to work together until I returned. They wanted to know what was happening, but I couldn't tell them anything. The best I could do was remain calm while I was taken away. He wasn't in handcuffs, but he was pretty close to it. He was taken about 15 miles away to an Army base. And early the next morning, after breakfasting on lukewarm coffee and stale toast, I was taken without a shave or shower to the general's office, where I stood at attention. Several officers from previous cruises with the Army were present. Through training, I had learned not to lose my temper when replying to questions from a superior officer so I wouldn't sound insubordinate. It was necessary, I reminded myself, to be careful and learn what was behind this matter. The general, carrying himself militarily, came in and told me to stand at attention, which I was already doing. He asked for my name, rank, and serial number, which I'm sure he already knew. I felt like a prisoner of war, which essentially I was. He then directed an aide to hand me a V-mail letter. "Have you seen this letter before?" the general asked. "I don't recall ever seeing this letter before," I replied truthfully. "Is that your unit censor stamp?" "Yes, sir," I acknowledged, recognizing the imprint with my initials on it. He asked if I had read and censored the contents of the letter. "No, sir, I don't read the crew's mail." "Do you know that failing to censor mail in a war zone is against Army regulations and is punishable by court-martial?" "No, sir," I said, which wasn't exactly truthful, but I had never really been conscious of the law as it might pertain to my small unit. The general directed me to read the V-mail letter, which was addressed to the Office of Rationing, Sacramento, California, and went something like this. "Dear sirs, if my father comes to your office and requests ration stamps to purchase 20 gallons of gasoline for fishing, please give him the stamps, because yesterday our air-sea rescue boat used up to 80 gallons taking officers and their lady friends out fishing. Sincerely, Corporal William Cheney, P-399. I won't tell you what happened to him, but it wasn't fun. I mean, it's hard to believe, but it did happen. I'll tell you another little story without going back to read it. When they were at Guadalcanal, And prior to this incident, the Army officers had requested that they take them and their lady friends who were nurses fishing in the crash boat off Guadalcanal. And the crew was not happy about that for a lot of reasons, but that's not why they were there. They were there to, save pilots, not take people on a fishing excursion. And so the first time they went out, they went down, the skipper went down into the engine room and talked to George, and so he cut one of the engines. They had twin 650 Hall Scott engines. And he cut one of the engines, and then they slowly turned the boat sideways, so it was just rocking. And pretty soon there was a lot of green nurses and generals. And so pretty soon the general came over and said that he wanted to be taken back to shore. So they did it a second time, and the second time they did the same thing. The medic on board the boat was named Homer Baker. And they had a little, I don't know if it's on the picture here or not. They had a little dinghy, like an 8-foot dinghy, that they could use to go to shore. And so they had to kind of shuffle these naval or Army officers and the nurses back to shore. Well, Baker was really not happy about this, so he got the general, the fat-ass general, I think is what he called him, and got him in the boat and turned around and rowed him and backed him up to the, I don't know if you can see this, but that's a water exhaust, a hot water exhaust from the engine. The general was sitting with his back end to the back end of the boat, and Baker backed him right up to the water, shooting out the hot, steamy water shooting out of there. Somehow he got away with it. I don't know how that happened. As they got further along up into the islands, air raids were incessant. Every night the Japanese sent over at least one flight of bombers, and they often would come in low over Halmahera during the day to bomb the airstrips. Incoming afternoon flights could only land if strips were damage-free. Otherwise, they had to try and make it to Sanzapor, which was another island in the vicinity. Over 2 months, we sweated out more than 100 raids, and the Japanese weren't dropping geisha pillows either. We were all weary from the night work as well as the ups and downs of the night air raids. We weren't getting enough sleep. Before we were due to pick up the native scouts, we ran into a little excitement. Now, when he's talking about the native scouts, they went out to an island in the blackness of the night and cruised in real carefully. It was a Japanese-held island, and they let these native scouts off, and they went ashore for a couple of days and just sat there and observed what the Japanese were doing to get the information. And then the boat had to come back and sneak in and pick them up and get out of there. So that's what he was talking about with a little excitement. This probably was the most hair-raising experience they had. On December 13th, a beautiful tropical morning, 4 light green P-40 Kitty Hawk fighters from the Royal Australian Air Force 80 Squadron took off from Morotai. I don't know if you go back to the maps. Morotai was right up there. In that island, half the island was Japanese and half was Allies.
Where's Australia?
Yeah, see if I can get you. Let's see. Okay, it's right down here. Here's New Guinea, and Australia would be right down in here.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll start over here. On December 13th, a beautiful tropical morning, 4 light green P-40 Kitty Hawk fighters from the Royal Australian Air Force 80 Squadron took off from Morotai on a routine mission to strafe Japanese positions on Halmahera across the Morotai Strait. As the squadron struck targets along Galila Bay, anti-aircraft fire hit the plane flown by Flight Sergeant James Leonard. At approximately 09:05 hours, Leonard crash-landed his damaged aircraft on the beach a mile north of Galila Village. Severely injured, the 20-year-old Aussie pilot took refuge under the left wing. 30 miles to the north, the Seahorse cruised along on calm seas off Halmahera's north tip, a routine patrol. Some of the crew were still in their bunks catching up on sleep when our call letters crackled over the radio from Peto Tower at 09:35 hours. Responding to the base, we received the aircraft's approximate location. The Seahorse bolted ahead while Baker called general quarters, knowing the area bristled with Japanese troops and gun emplacements. All hands, a little bleary-eyed, were up and working at once. We closed on the plane's reported position in about 40 minutes, preparing to go ashore in a rubber raft. Jep was on watch, looking to spot the wreckage. Suddenly, he turned to me on the bridge and said, "Skip, we've got trouble." The plane was lying about 10 feet from the water's edge, right under Japanese guns. As we neared the upper end of the beach at 10:20, a Navy PBY circling the area started to land near shore, seemingly unaware of the heavy concentration of Japanese guns protecting the nearby Galila airstrip. As the plane was about to hit the water, the pilot gunned both engines and the Catalina climbed back into the air, alerted by Peto Tower to the danger. The Royal Australian Air Force pilot, who appeared to be injured, was visible under the wing, so I circled the beach toward the beach. The Japanese opened up on us with 90mm anti-aircraft guns depressed to cover water approaches. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see tall geysers off our port beam. "Those aren't fish jumping," I yelled to Jep. I zigged and zagged, but soon realized that the shots were going over our head as we neared shore. We were safe from the big guns as long as we were close to the beach. Barzo called Peto Tower and informed them we were outgunned and requested air cover while we provided Morotai with a play-by-play description as the battle developed. The tower responded that the 38th Air Group would cover us and stand by, adding that the whole island was listening to Barzo's description of the radio attempt on the tower radio. The whole island, he meant, was back at Morotai. Within minutes, 8 P-38 Lightnings from Peto roared in, strafing the shore batteries and Japanese riflemen moving toward the beach. I spun the Seahorse around and headed out to sea. It was apparent that approaching the beach in a rubber raft was impossible. So Jep and Whitey, our two best swimmers, volunteered to swim ashore to bring the Aussie pilot back to the P-399. They put on their Mae West under blue shirts and attempt to hide the yellow vests, and Baker tied a 1/3 inch line around their waist. Then we made a starboard strafing run on the trees and foliage behind the beach after feinting a movement out to sea. Suddenly the unthinkable happened. Our port engine conked out. I needed its reverse to keep us from washing up on a very unfriendly island. George was back on Morotai with an infected foot, and our substitute engineer was of no help. About 50 yards from the beach, we went aground in the sand. Jep and Whitey dropped off the stern where they weren't visible to the Japanese and started for shore. The P-38s continued low-level strafing runs while Bake in one of the turrets and Ronnie on the bow laid down withering fire with our twin 50 caliber machine guns. As Jep later wrote to his father, the boys on the boat were giving them hell. You should have seen the cook on the bow guns out in front of God and everybody, really pouring the lead. Snipers targeted Jep and Whitey when they were only 10 yards from the boat, but they continued toward shore where they could see the pilot alongside the fuselage. Then all hell cut loose with heavy enemy fire, so we backed out of the sand, picked up Jep and Whitey, and retired to open water where the P-406 came alongside. Warrant Officer John Cranston and his engineer, Warrant Officer James Gray, climbed aboard the Seahorse. It was apparent the Japanese were using the pilot to decoy us into a trap. The fighters kept ground troops away from the Royal Australian Air Force plane, while we called for Navy PTs to lay a smoke screen and bring additional firepower. By the time PTs 162 and 365 arrived, we had the port engine running again with assistance from Cranston and Gray, who helped keep the Seahorse off the beach. A new plan conceived in consultation with Peto Tower and the PT skippers called for the PTs to launch smoke mortar shells onto the beach to shield the P-399 from the Japanese. PT-162 made a strafing run and drew heavy fire, while PT-365 stayed offshore with 7 crewmen suffering with shrapnel wounds from enemy fire. These PTs have been battle-tested over many months, moving from the southern slot up the island chain. In early August 1943, PT-162 was the boat closest to John F. Kennedy's PT-109 when it was rammed by the Japanese destroyer Amaguri in the Blackett Strait during an ill-conceived mission. The smoke screen was successful, and the Seahorse moved toward the beach, again going aground on a sandbar. Jep and Whitey went back in the water and swam toward shore. When they were in 50 yards of the shore, they observed that the tide had risen. The pilot and the plane were nearly awash, and there was no sign of life. At the same time, the Japanese launched a mortar barrage. Jep and Whitey, growing weary, attempted to inflate their Mae Wests. Jep's worked, but Whitey's didn't, so they swam back, sharing the good one. Once we pulled them back aboard, we retreated across the danger line, averting enemy fire. It was a sad and disappointing ending to the mission. Barzo reported the situation to Pito, and the P-38s returned to base. With only one fully functional engine, I requested that we return to base, which was approved. We were 18 miles or so from Morotai when a lumbering LCM, one of those open landing craft, with a drop bow was spotted coming toward us. Clinging to the middle grill on the top gate was Lieutenant Colonel Wallace Ford, our squadron commander. The Seahorse eased alongside the LCM and he clambered aboard. Ford said he had been listening to the Galila Bay battle and it got so exciting that he decided to come over to see it, but his boat was too slow. The colonel congratulated everyone who had a part in the attempt to save the Australian pilot. I won't go on any further than that with that. The next day when they cleaned the guns, there were 6 inches of empty shell casings in the gun turrets. That just kind of tells you how much lead was being thrown. As the war started to wind down, they were all pretty anxious to get home. And they were supporting a Marine Corps fighter squadron around Zamboanga. And at that time, the Japanese weren't throwing too much at them, simply because they were running out of pilots and they were running out of a lot of things. I won't go into too much more detail than that. But there was a very poignant moment for me at the end of the skipper's story. And that was 3 of them took a freighter back to the United States from Manila when the war ended. My dad and Ron Albrecht, who had been the cook and one of the gunners on the boat, came home the long way. They had a 3-month cruise on another Liberty ship through the Panama Canal to New Orleans, and then when they were just about to New Orleans, they were ordered to go to Baltimore. So they did a big circle, and they ended up going to Baltimore. But the skipper, Reuben Barzo and Whitey and the skipper ended up in Oakland, California. And the next day, we checked into a hotel, the skipper wrote. Reuben and I were traveling east, back to the United States. The skipper was from Poughkeepsie, New York. And Whitey, whose home was in Southern California, decided to stay over with us. Their trains were scheduled to leave the next afternoon and mine the following day. That evening, we each bought a bottle of liquor, 3 feathers in my case for old time's sake, and then we went to a fine restaurant. Afterward, we went back to our rooms to drink, but we each had only 1 or 2. A glass of 3 feathers brought back memories of past celebrations. When the skipper was ready to go overseas, he went out and bought a case of 3 feathers whiskey and hid it away in the hold of the boat. The rest of the crew didn't know he had it, so every once in a while he'd bring a bottle out and they'd have a little nip. The reason we didn't drink much was that we were busy taking showers. One after another of us jumped into one of the 2-room showers to make up for all the saltwater baths we had endured. This fresh gushing water made us feel as clean as we did in the waterfall on the island off Malabang, Mindanao. Reuben's train east was leaving at 14:30 hours, and Whitey had a seat booked for Los Angeles, so they asked me to ride over to the station with them in a cab. It was raining. We got out of the cab across the street from the entrance to the terminal. To my great surprise, they saluted me and said, "So long, skipper." Picking up their gear, they hurried through the rain to the terminal, never looking back. I stood there with the cabbie looking at me, glad it was raining, an excuse for the water running down my face. The cab driver got out, loaded me and my memories into the taxi, and drove me back to an empty room. And that literally was the end. They never got together again. My dad and the skipper met one time in New York on business, but that was it. They all went their separate ways. And one of the things I was able to find out, this is after we had lost the skipper, was what happened to every one of those members of the crew. And one was pretty shocking, but I won't tell you that story because if you read the book, you'll find out. So, are there any questions? Yeah.
Putting this book together, what surprised you the most?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, what surprised me the most about writing the book? I guess what really surprised me the most, I don't know if it's surprised, but it certainly had a big impact on me, was the fact that, as I said at the beginning, that these were ordinary men doing extraordinary things. And I've only touched on some of the extraordinary things they did here. They were just regular guys. And I'll tell you what, as I was growing up, I was born in 44. And by the late 40s and early 50s, I was old enough to start to pay attention to people. And we lived on a leafy green street in Millwood. And that whole street had veterans on it from various, parts of the military. Those guys were serious as a heart attack about life. When they came home, they wanted to start families, they wanted to find a home, build a home, buy a home, get on with their careers. And they didn't, I don't know how many of you had dads that were in that age group, but they didn't suffer fools very well. And, the strap now and then came out. I know with a lot of my friends. I mean, that's the way it was. My hero in life was my dad. And it wasn't because of what he did, not because of what he did in the Pacific, or the fact that he won the Silver Star along with Whitey when they went to try to save that Australian pilot. It was the way they conducted themselves as men after the war. They were great role models, at least the people that I knew. They were serious about family. They were serious about, as I said, careers. In those days, if you got into trouble in school as a kid, you were afraid to come home to your parents. You weren't worried about the school. You were more worried about your parents.
Double jeopardy.
Yeah. I mean, the school was going to be bad enough, but I knew facing my dad was going to be the tough part. Now, there's one last thing I wanted to show on here that I didn't. That's my dad. That's my dad in 1942. That's him 3 years later. Look at that face. There was a lot of wear and tear in growing up. He was beat. That was in 1945, just before the war ended. That's one thing that always got me, and it's what I always thought about these guys. He was 25 when he came home. I look at 25-year-olds today. It's a different world. They're still kids. These guys weren't kids when they came home. They were mature. They had seen a lot, and some of what the crew saw in the Philippines was unspeakable. Some of it's in the book. I know that my dad had PSTD, or PTSD, whatever, for at least 10 years after the war. They didn't have a name for it in those days.
Shell shock.
Yeah. But you could tell that he was still bothered by a lot of what he had seen. And when I did the interview with him, this was, I think, 1990, there was one incident where they were off the canal, two P-38 fighters that had just been out on a mission and were coming back. And the crash boat was offshore, just off Lunga Point, and just cruising along. And the two P-38s decided that they were going to give them a thrill. And so they were wing on wing, and they dove at the crash boat. Well, one of them didn't pull up and crashed right next to the boat, so close that the water came over the boat. And my dad and Whitey jumped in the water and went and pulled the pilot out. Unfortunately, he passed. And as my dad told me that story, he broke down and finally had to get up and leave the room for a few minutes just to kind of recompose himself. It was 50 years after the event, and it was still stuck in his mind. And the skipper had a story when we talked. Now, going back to how we did the book, once I called the skipper and we started to talk, Amy and our daughter Jane and I went out 2 summers and spent time in Poughkeepsie. Right after, he became acquainted with some pretty good stories to tell about that. He was a Democrat, the skipper was, and they tried to get him to run for office, and he wasn't too thrilled about that, but he had to go to these meetings with Eleanor. And so he had some very interesting stories to tell about that. There's one in here about the skipper. I'll let you decide whether if you read the book about that. It's a pretty interesting story. It's not licentious or anything like that. It's just an interesting story. But it's a human story. All of these pieces are human. And I just hope that with a book like this and the hundreds, if not thousands, of other books that are written about these kind of operations and the people who served need to stay with us, because it's real easy to forget as time goes by. Kids today a lot of them don't even know much about World War II, let alone, what happened just maybe 20 years ago. So, any other questions? Yeah.
You talked about reading quite a bit of World War II history growing up. Would you say that now being able to see and hear more testimony is a more effective way of telling the story of World War II, or would you say they kind of complement each other, the general World War II history?
I think they do complement each other, but I'll tell you, in recent years, I've noticed, because I'm in the publishing world now, a lot of the books coming out are these stories about individuals, whether it were pilots or people that served in the Army in Europe or the Navy. They're personal stories. They're after the war, back in the 50s, when the first books came out that I was reading, they weren't so personal as much as they were about units, or like submarine operations and that sort of thing. The most interesting ones to me lately have been the personal ones about individual people. Any other thoughts or questions? Well, they saved over 30 pilots and air crews. We didn't put every rescue in here simply because it was a lot of it would have been repetitious. But a lot of the situations were pretty hairy. In one case, there was a B-24 Liberator bomber that had crash landed in the water less than a mile off a Japanese-held island, and they were just floating there, and the tide was pushing them closer to shore where the Japanese were waiting. And the boat got there just in time, and they were standing on the wings of the plane, and they were able to, get them off there, and there were a couple of the air crew who were pretty seriously injured, and Baker got them in the litter baskets that they had, that they carried them in, and they got away with that. On another instance, they picked up a guy who was sitting there in his raft. I think he was a smart aleck Navy guy, I'm not positive, but he was sitting there in his raft. He had a sail up because they had these little rafts that would sail. He had a fishing line out, and he was eating a sandwich. And he said, "You guys took your good old time getting here, I don't know that I would have had that kind of a sense of humor if I'd have been the guy in the raft, And there was another case, more than one case, where the pilots would come aboard to get on their knees and pray. And one particular guy got on and thanked the Navy, and they didn't have the heart to tell him they weren't the Navy, that they were the Army Air Force. But they had some, it was all human. Everything was human about these things, and these guys all had feelings. And I, like I said, I knew that my dad particularly had a real compassion for these people. For a fact, he told me, and he said it during the war, that he was glad that his mission was to save people, not to kill people in the middle of a god-awful killing part of the Pacific at that time. Anything else? Well, there's some goodies over there and coffee.
And books.
And books, if you're interested. I'm not here to sell books, but I have them if you want them. And thank you for coming tonight.
Yeah, I'll just echo what George just said. Thank you so much for coming to the library tonight. I hope you learned something. Maybe you're interested in Crash Boat. We have copies, but I think they're actually all checked out. So George is selling a few over here. We also have some amazing goodies available for you to eat here or take home with you. And thank you to those who tuned in on YouTube with us. And let's give George a warm round of applause. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
telling your story.